Okay. Everyone on Zoom, can you hear me okay? All right, great, thank you. Okay, we got a group here. Got a lot of people here, actually. On Zoom, you're only going to be able to see, actually not even half the room, but we've got another half of the room here as well. So Anne, lovely Anne, is going to try to help me by hosting and kind of letting me know who wants to be speaking when I'm not able to see everybody. And okay, so first off, I'll say welcome aboard, everybody. This is East Point's Movie Critic Discussion Night. I'm Ed Katz, my wife Ann, and let's see, we're doing the Battle of Algiers tonight, the 1966 classic film. And our next time is going to be April 28th. For those of you participating, I will send an invite. I'll need everyone to sign in, so don't leave before you sign in and put your email address, and I will send you the ballots because I'll pick the films and you'll be able to go from there. Everyone who's on Facebook, please like Katz Reviews. I would appreciate that. I'm trying to get my following to 500, and we've got like another 25 or 30 to go. All right, so Battle of Algiers. Let's start off. Can you want to go? All right. I mean, I sent an email, so they should have all the info. But okay. So by show of hands, who liked the movie? Okay, so about 2/3 here. And more on there.
Yeah.
Well, thought it was well done. Thought it was good. Okay.
I thought it was interesting.
Who would recommend it to their friends?
That's a whole different discussion.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
You wouldn't?
No.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a movie you recommend to friends. It depends on the friend, I think, and what kind of movies they like. If they like comedies, probably don't want to send them this way. Okay, so and then for those of you who did not like it, or didn't, okay. Just a couple and Howard. All right, let's start with Howard. I don't know if you're muted or not, but if you could unmute Howard and tell us what you didn't like about it.
He didn't hear you?
He can't hear you.
He's not speaking.
He's on
I had a problem maybe with the time watching it at this particular time, with all the war going on and all the things that are going on in the world, to watch I'll call it a war movie.
Sure.
Didn't exactly turn me on now. Maybe at a peaceful time when I could appreciate the movie, but I kept thinking of the world and other situations, and I really couldn't concentrate on it as much as I would have liked to.
Okay, I would make the argument that this makes it even more relevant because of what's going on.
Can you back up a touch, and maybe that's why you chose it? Is that why you chose it?
That's a good question.
Yes, that's part of why I chose it, which is a great question, David, and thank you for asking, because I actually brought an article, which you're not going to be able to see on Zoom, but it's from the New York Times, January 27, and the headline was, Macron recognizes the tragic page, which is in quotes because that was his line, of France's past in Algeria as the elections loom. So he acknowledged the suffering of the colonists and their descendants and France's role in that suffering. So that came up in January 27th, and I had seen the film about a year or so ago, and as soon as I saw that, it kind of struck me that it was kind of relevant again, and then with what's going on in the Ukraine, and so it kind of, I thought it was relevant. Yes, please.
But Macron is running for the election,
Yes,
and his country is
Yes.
full of a lot of immigrants.
Yes, and
refugees
some
from all
Algerians,
the- from
right.
Tunisia, from
Right.
all of the colonies.
yes,
So he wants to make sure that they hear him.
right.
So,
Excellent point,
you know,
that if
that's-
he may be politically motivated by the timing of it.
the
Can't
time.
argue with that. Can't
Whereas
argue with
right
that.
now, it's happening in Naples.
Right, right. Okay. Very fair point. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay. All right. Now, so for those of you who did like it, think it was well done, anyone want to, oh, did you have another thought on why you didn't?
It was just hard to watch.
Yes.
It's tough.
That's a fair statement. Sure. Yeah. Anyone else? Any negatives?
I like history, but I don't always know all the details. And I can remember as a young kid, the Algerian situation, and I never totally understood what was going on. So it was kind of interesting to kind of see it in the context of then And then especially highlighted what's going on in Ukraine too. So, history repeats itself.
Right. There was a line.
One sec. That's not true, what he's saying. I don't think there's a equivalency between Russia attacking Ukraine and eternal kind of,
I think the details are different, but I think the love of your country is there.
Yeah.
And that
Right.
And wanting to be free.
and wanting to be free.
Yeah, colonization is essentially evil. These are just different forms of evil.
Well, there was a line towards the end of the film as two, and I don't know what rank they were, but two apparently high-ranking French military personnel were walking out, and they said, well, things were fine for 130 years. I don't know what happened now.
Yeah.
Well, I read about that. That wasn't true,
Right.
but that was his perspective on how he was viewing it. So that was kind of interesting, but I'll get into a little of that, but yes.
Okay, for me, it was very, very relevant, the movie, even though it's very different. I didn't expect that it was so late in the years, because it started in 56 and they didn't get it till 62.
Right, right.
While where I come from in Egypt, which was a country by itself, it wasn't a colony of
Right.
France or whatever, but it had started in 52 when they deposed the king. And it became a republic right a little bit after that. And that's when all the European and the Jews and the British and everybody left. But I thought it had been sooner with Algiers and Tunisia and all those countries that were colonies.
Pretty similar timing, actually.
Right.
Right.
So,
Okay. All right.
Somebody on the screen has a question.
Yes, Debbie.
Unmute, Deb.
Yeah, I just unmuted. I just found the parallel wasn't so much the details of, how the war started or all that you're talking about. What I found so unbelievably striking is when people have that spirit, whether it was when, Israel was fighting, or, the Algerians were fighting, or, the Ukrainians in this case. It's just, they're so much alike. And that's what I found so interesting about it, is that passion to keep their country and, their principles and not being taken over. And it was that passion what I really enjoyed about it. Even though there was a part with the torture, which I want you to know, I had a real hard time watching that. I did, but it was, there were parts that were difficult, but
Absolutely.
generally speaking, I actually did talk about not recommending the movie. I did actually recommend my daughter see the movie.
Okay. So for general audience here, do you think the members of the FLN, the Algerian freedom fighters, were terrorists?
Yes.
Yes. Only one so far?
Definitely terrorists. They're definitely terrorists.
Yeah, but terrorists, but they're fighting for a cause
Yeah.
they believe in.
Okay,
That's
but
what you mean a terrorist.
doesn't every terrorist generally do that?
Right,
Yeah.
you know,
As
But the
much as
tactics
American
were-
revolutionaries.
No.
Right.
They were terrorists.
Yes, on Zoom. Yep, your hand.
Isn't the expression one man's terrorist is the other man's freedom fighter, right?
Exactly, right. So let me ask the other side of the question. Do you think Colonel Mathau was a good person or a bad person?
Mathieu.
Mathieu, thank you,
Mathieu, I'm
yes.
saying,
He was the one that was sent over.
yes.
Yes, he ran the French operation in Algiers.
One thing that struck me is at one point he said he admired, I think, one of the terrorists.
Jafar.
And it made me
he's
realize
the guy there.
that this has been happening since forever, that the military men are saying, we're just following directions of our country. And so he didn't seem to be evil. He admired this person, yet he was trying to kill him.
He also, if you remember the press conference, which I'll get to also later, he spoke very highly of one of them who died.
Yeah.
But having read more of the history, the one who died, he was asked about because he hung himself, but supposedly he had certain circumstances which would have made it very difficult for him to hang himself. And it did really kind of indicate from what I read in history that they killed him. and tried to make it, attempted to make it look sort of like suicide just to kind of cover it up. But he did say he showed respect to them because he understood they were fighting for a cause, and he was there because he was on orders to do so, and he had a job to do, so he was going to try to do it as well as he could. And he was defending that when the French press was interrogating him as to, well, let me ask you, do you want France to run Algeria? If so, then you have to accept the consequences of how we have to do that. So he put that back on the public, and as we know, a few years later, the answer was no. They couldn't stomach the tactics they were using to keep Algeria under French rule. So, all right, I want to get to a little of the history of the movie. So the director, interestingly enough, I don't know if people saw this, and I'm not sure if his first name is Gillo or Hilo, Pontecorvo, is Italian. You're probably wondering, why did an Italian movie director make this movie? Well, you remember the character of Jafar, who was the older terrorist, who was the one escorted in the police vehicle, who surrendered instead of opting to be blown up. He surrendered, and Matteau was discussing with him in the car ride about, that he thought he made the right decision to surrender and things like that. The actor wasn't really an actor, but the person who was Jafar, this was his story. He really lived this story, and he's the one who wrote it. And he's the one who found this director who had made other politically oriented movies, because he wanted him to make the movie, but he wanted him to show both sides, which is fascinating because, and also he liked his technique. If you're familiar with Roberto Rossellini, Italian filmmaker, who did the neo-realist type of cinema. So it looked kind of like a documentary, even though it really wasn't. But there was only one actor. The Colonel was the only actual professional actor in the whole movie. So the man's name was, and I have it here, Youssef Saadi, and he was Jafar, or Kadar, as they were saying. But the movie was a co-production of an Italian creative team and the Algerian FLN government, and they produced the film. And Jafar starred in it, Saadi Youssef, who, by the way, and I want to read this, some of this to you, just died this past September at the age of 93.
You said something just a second ago. There was a co-production between the FLN and the.
Well, they were in power when the movie was made. It was their government at that point. So yeah, because it was 66. So I don't know if you can see this picture here, but this is him in the movie. And I will try to show it to the camera a little bit so they can see it too. We'll see how this works. I don't know. All right, you can kind of see him there. All right. So his obituary was fascinating. It was in the New York Times, and it was quite a lengthy obituary. I sent the email. Just haven't looked for the email. All right. So it says Saadi Youssef, a revolutionary leader who fought French rule in Algeria in the 50s and then set in motion and acted in the Battle of Algiers. The acclaimed film died on September 10th. This is 2021. His daughter confirmed the death. He had heart problems. He became involved in the opposition movements while he was a teenager. In 1954, joined the FLN, which is the Front de Libération Nationale, the leading national organizationist during the war. He said, while I was in prison, the executions were always done at dawn. So when I saw the sun coming through the prison bars, I knew I was going to live through another day, but I was very certain that I would be executed. He talked about making the movie at the time in 2004. He said, everyone swore by Italian neorealism. That's why I went to Italy to look for a director and another screenwriter for the Battle of Algiers. With a script based on his book, he met with Mr. Pontecorvo, who was said to have been considering, this is interesting, his own movie about the Algerian War, one that he hoped would star Paul Newman as a French paratrooper turned journalist. They changed that around, obviously. The movie was filmed in Algeria with Mr. Youssef as a producer, had its premiere at the Venice Film Festival in 1966, and caused a sensation for its startling realism. Some scenes, especially of bombings, looked so authentic. The film in its initial showings was preceded by a disclaimer saying no newsreel footage had been used. The director, Steven Soderbergh, said in a video that was made for the Criterion collection when they issued this DVD collection in 2004, said there are a couple of sequences which look very dangerous. I don't know if you could do them now. The director died in 2006. According to Yasef, Pontecorvo insisted I appear in the film. I had to play in the movie's moments that I had lived 7 years before. The war, the prison, the torture, all of this was still fresh in my memory. Here's a picture of Yasef, you know, a little closer to his demise. Here, go ahead, bring it right up. So it was, yeah, if we could show it, there you go. Okay. So
he didn't actually play his own character in the movie. He played someone who was in the uprising.
he played, some of the characters were composites of people.
Right.
The colonel was a composite of 2 actual generals, but one of them was named Massot, so they made it pretty close. A film critic from the New York Times wrote in 2004, apart from Orson Welles, no one before had so imaginatively imitated the look of a newsreel. Although Orson Welles had pulled the trick only for the March of Time segment of Citizen Kane, whereas Pontecorvo kept up his illusion for 123 minutes. The movie won the Golden Lion in Venice, the film's festival's top award, and in '67 it was chosen to kick off the New York Film Festival. It was nominated for Oscars for Best Foreign Language Film, Screenplay, and Director. It's been studied over the years by both militant groups like the Black Panthers and by the Pentagon. Mr. Yasef, who later in life served as a senator in Algeria's National Assembly, readily acknowledged that orders he had issued resulted in many deaths. But he drew a distinction between actions committed in the cause of liberation and the actions of more recent groups in exporting terrorism. Now remember, this was 2004. He had particular disdain for suicide bombings, a tactic his resistance fighters did not employ, which you saw in the movie they didn't. He said, the fight gave meaning to our lives. In 2007, he said it. We weren't in it to die. So I had some notes when I was watching the film. There was a fascinating scene where Colonel Mateau says, interrogation in such a way as to always get an answer. He didn't say torture, but it was certainly implied. Okay, the FLN tried a week-long strike to show the United Nations their resolve. The French military responded. How? Do you remember how they responded to the strike?
Yeah, they arrested everybody.
They broke up of the stores and ripped everything out, threw it in the street.
Well, they went into the people's apartments and said, get to work.
Yeah, and then they opened the stores and threw everything in the street.
Right, right. So Mateau said the FLN was like, do you remember what analogy he used to describe them? He said a tapeworm.
Oh, yeah.
Right, you remember?
That was a great film.
Where you need to destroy the head or heads, meaning Jafar and Ali Lapointe. So my question I had while watching it was, what was wrong with French rule? And in 1951, a French journalist denounced what was going on with the torture, which actually included beatings, electroshock, waterboarding, burns, and rape. Prisoners were locked up without food, buried alive, thrown from helicopters to their death, or into the sea with concrete on their feet. So this is what the French did. In 1951, a journalist said, is there a Gestapo in Algeria? And someone argued, okay, he argued about the use of torture. Such tactics sat uncomfortably with France's revolutionary history and brought unbearable comparisons with Nazi Germany. The French national psyche would not tolerate these parallels. And one of the generals, who was one of the composites of the colonel, admitted in 2000 that systematic torture techniques were used during the war, and he justified it. He also admitted that the assassination of one of the heads was made to look like a suicide, but it wasn't a suicide. Okay, I wanted to find the where it talked about the history. And I know it's interesting.
Ed,
Yes.
you asked the question, you know, was it justified? How did the French really treat the Algerians? I mean, the sense from the movie and the sense from other reading is they were really second-class citizens. the Algerians. They're living in ghettos, treated differently. The techniques that you just read through, that litany of techniques that the police used, clearly was oppressive. So there's no doubt that if we were living under that kind of oppression, that we would want to get our freedom and be treated equally.
Right, and let me be devil's advocate for a minute, because the movie picked up basically at the start of these terrorist actions, but you don't know what the situation, at least from the movie, was before. So I was trying to get some context on that, and I found an article, oh boy, I can't find where it was from. Okay, the controversy and ethics questions, the Carnegie Council did a paper on this. Do I have the date on that? I'm not sure. I don't see the date on this, but they said, okay, the French won military control. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, well, that's after. Okay. By the 1930s, Algerian nationalists and, okay, going all the way back, Algeria was colonized by the French in 1830. They were ruled as part of France. The Muslims were denied many of the rights granted to Europeans. Few Muslims were allowed to vote. They faced higher taxes, and many public places were segregated. So yeah, I would say they were oppressed. I mean, you saw in the movie the scenes of the French people at their nice clubs living it up, and then you saw the way the Algerians lived not so nice. So even though I would say Pontecorvo showed both sides of the story, there was another thing, and I think Roger Ebert mentioned it in a review, which I'd like to read part of soon, where he talks about the music. And the director was one of the people who composed the music, along with Ennio Morricone. And the music kind of had sympathetic notes when you saw the Algerians getting killed by the French military. But when the FLN fighters were shooting police in the back, there was no music. There was no music at all. So and Pontecorvo said he took a political side to the movie, but he did show both sides. So, I mean, you could debate how well he did, how fair was he? That's always any kind of a, whether it's a documentary or not, there's always a debate, were both sides treated fairly. But I think, you know, even though he did, and Roger Ebert said the first time he saw it, he thought it was very fair. Second time he saw it, he noticed the slant towards the FLN, which makes sense given who wrote it was one of the FLN fighters. I thought the first time I saw it, I thought it had a bias towards the FLN, but I thought it still showed Mateau pretty more than fairly, actually. They showed he had a hard job to do and he was doing it the best he could under the circumstances. Did anyone have a dispute with that? Okay. All right. Yes, Mike.
With the military, ours is not the reason why, ours is but to do or die.
Right.
And that's what we're discussing here is that aspect of what took place.
Right.
You know, considering that.
Right. So as far as speaking of dying, the total death toll between 1954 and 62 remains under debate, with the Algerian government claiming over 1 million casualties were incurred, including rebels killed by French troops, as well as Algerian and European civilians killed by French forces and the FLN. The official French estimate was 350,000 dead. There were also produced roughly 2 million Algerian refugees, and another 900,000 Europeans fled the country in 1962. So there was definitely, you know, the claim by that French officer at the end that, you know, everything was great for a while, not so much.
And I'm curious if, when you looked into the history, because the movie didn't seem to talk about the religious aspects of Muslim versus Catholic.
Right.
I mean, that could have certainly played a huge role.
Yes.
But did you see that in history that, you know, that was truly played out that way?
No, I didn't see that really mentioned from what, I mean, I didn't do a ton of
Wasn't there some
research on
mention
it,
in
I
the
did a
movie
little.
about Muslims, you know, how they lived, and there was some mention there at some point in the Casbah. The Casbah was all Muslim.
Yes.
And I think it was a direct attack on the Muslims, not on.
Right.
For religious beliefs. I'm wondering also, you know, France just had lost Vietnam and get thrown out. How much of it was retribution for that this, you know, this colonization was, and that's why they went in so heavy to try to remain in Algeria.
That's a good point. And Mateau was supposed to have been in Indochine. So he saw a lot of stuff. He saw wins, he saw losses, because he did other stuff
What was
too.
the point of being there? What did they get out of it? Somebody said oil. Is there a lot of oil in Algeria?
There was some, I can't remember what the other exports were. I read it, but I don't remember what it was.
Ports and everything.
Didn't that
Yeah, I mean,
show,
also from a strategic military standpoint, it was a good location as well.
For what
didn't Matteau have a comment about we lost it in Indochina, but we're not going to lose this one, something like that?
Yes,
Some kind of a comment like that.
right. Right, no, that's true.
And
Yes,
I thought one of the sub themes in the movie was Revolution 101, because in the beginning he says we can't, the FLN, we can't really do this until we get the people on our side.
right.
We got to give them social things. We got to give them food. And if you flash back to the Bolsheviks, they gave bread to the people. The Hezbollah
Let them eat
wasn't,
cake.
yeah, the
Also.
Hezbollah wasn't successful until they had the social wing, their education, they provide health. The people who are down and out, they give them help, they give them food, and then they get buy-in. So that's part of the story here. The other thing I saw in this was escalating revenge.
Yes,
Just like the Israelis, you
Yes.
know, one bomb from the French resulted in 3 bombs by the rebels.
right.
So I thought that was another theme of revolution.
Yeah, they started with the shooting a couple of the officers, and all of a sudden then bombs started on both sides. So it escalated in the big racetrack with the 3 bombs going off at the racetrack. So, right.
Mary.
Oh, yes, sorry, Mary.
And one thing I found interesting was the role of women in this revolution.
Sure. Oh, please, a little louder.
Yeah, I thought the role of women in this revolution was really interesting. The way that they carried weapons in their baskets, and they not only handed off the weapons, but then they received them back after the murder or whatever it was. And then the fact that there was one woman leader, or 2, I guess, 2 women leaders who chose to die in the battle. I saw some parallels there to Ukraine, you know, when women are shown preparing to shoot rifles or train, you know, to work alongside the men. I thought that was a very interesting thing.
So let me ask you a question. And this was actually a question in this article I was reading. Does this film represent women's empowerment or impression within an Islamic society? Because the women were used for military purposes. You saw the checkpoints where they didn't check the women, right? So the women were able to get through without being checked. So they start stashing weapons with the women as they go through, and the men are like, I have nothing, you know? So that was the way they did. So is that like a pro-feminist thing?
I don't know if it's pro-feminist, but I think it parallels other revolutions where women had a role. And, you know, they had agency, and they decided that they were either going to participate, you know, on the front line or in the back and play some role. And it looked to me, one of the other things I found really interesting was it took a long time, like you were saying, for people to figure out whether or not they were going to commit to this. And when they did, it was about a year later, and then they were all in the streets. It was women, it was children, it was
Right.
teenagers.
Towards the end of the movie.
Toward the end of the movie.
That's actually a problem I have with the movie, because I don't think it showed how it went from point A
Yeah.
with the revolutionaries all being killed, the leaders all being killed or captured. And then a year later, all of a sudden, the revolution started in the street and everyone's out there. There was a gap missing that I didn't think the film filled in for whatever reason. I don't know what the answer was.
I agree.
So they said, apparently, what I could see from reading was what was happening in Algiers with the revolutionaries doing these tactics. Some of them started spreading after the heads were captured or killed, and it started spreading in other parts. How it became a nationwide movement all of a sudden, I couldn't find that. So it was under the radar somehow, but they managed to do it. Now, interestingly enough, as far as the movie, this article says, generally regarded as historically accurate and balanced film, the director nonetheless considered his work to be politically motivated. In fact, the Battle of Algiers was based on the memoirs of Saadi Youssef, one of the leaders. The film was banned in France for 5 years after its release. Not too surprising, right? It's been used as a model for both insurgency and counterinsurgency tactics, including the use of torture. It's been used to train members of the Black Panthers and Argentine intelligence unit. It was speculated that Palestinian terror groups and Al-Qaeda may also use this film as a guide. It was screened at the Pentagon in 2003 in order to offer some insight into the challenges surrounding the US occupation of Iraq. Perhaps the most important lesson of the film, I'm reading here, and the French experience in Algeria is that successful military tactics, because if you saw, technically from the battle, the French won, but we saw what happened. They won the battle, but literally they lost the war. They do not lead to lasting peace unless accompanied with a successful political strategy. The use of torture inevitably backfired on the French, reducing public support for the occupation. Although the FLN was crushed, the closing scene in the movie portrays Algerians in 1964 taking to the streets and demanding independence. Okay, so that kind of goes to whether or not torture works. In the short term, maybe, but, and do you remember the reasons that the colonel justified the need for the aggressive interrogation techniques? Do you remember what his reason was? Remember the 24 hours? Okay, so when he was asked in the press conference scene, I don't remember if he said it in the press conference scene. I think he did. He said, all the members who are captured have been trained, the FLN members, not to say anything for 24 hours, which gives the information they have enough time to be made irrelevant. So that necessitated hurried up tactics by the French to try to extract information while it was still valid, which means they had to use torture. So that's where it came from. So that was his defense, and that's why he asked, if you want the French still in Algeria, you have to accept the consequences. So that was it. And then there was an article, from Slate that was from 2003 called the Pentagon's Film Festival, a primer for the Battle of Algiers, and it talks about the decision to show the movie is, quote, David Ignatius wrote. This was also in the Washington Post reported it. So this goes back to 2003. The decision to show the movie is one hopeful sign the military is thinking creatively and unconventionally about Iraq. And he quotes a Pentagon flyer that they put up in the Pentagon about showing the movie. How to win a battle against terrorism and lose the war of ideas. Children shoot soldiers at point blank range. Women plant bombs in cafes. Soon the entire Arab population builds to a mad fervor. Sound familiar? The French have a plan. It succeeds tactically, but fails strategically. To understand why, come to a rare showing of this film. That was on a flyer at the Pentagon, which I thought that's pretty fascinating. And this is like almost 40 years after the movie was made. Okay, so yeah, it was also called obligatory viewing for the Black Panthers. When the film was finally shown in France, theaters were bombed, and in Italy, viewers were attacked. So that was interesting. And is the movie accurate? Mateau, for his part, is based upon the real-life General Jacques Massou, who devised the counter-terrorist strategy. Many sequences are meticulously accurate, such as the famous one referred to by the Pentagon in its flyer, in which Algerian women put on Western clothes and makeup and then plant bombs at civilian targets. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. Do you remember the character of Ali Lapointe, right? Okay. Do you remember his recruitment where he gets the gun from the woman and then he goes to shoot the,
No bullets.
and he had no bullets? And you remember the justification for that?
Yeah.
Okay. One clue was given that they asked him to shoot the French officer, not the guy who was the stoolie.
Right.
And that's because they wanted to make sure he wasn't an undercover operative for the French, which would have no problem shooting the stoolie.
Right.
But shooting a French officer, that's different. So he passed the test. So that shows, and that's actual. Apparently, that's actually really the kind of things that happen. All right, there was a quote here. Wars aren't won with terrorism, said one key revolutionary, neither wars nor revolutions. But that depends in part on how the other side reacts to terror. And we saw what happened here. Okay. The Battle of Algiers is potentially most valuable and most dangerous as a point of comparison for the US military. While it has next to nothing to say about overall French strategy in Algeria, its most obvious military lesson, that torture is an efficient countermeasure to terror is a dangerous one in this particular instance. Aside from its moral horror, torture may not even elicit accurate information, though the film seems to suggest it is foolproof. Because they brought the guy they were torturing with them to make sure he was telling the truth. Okay, right, yeah, here it is. Should France remain in Algeria? If you answer yes, you must accept all the necessary consequences. And it says here, Matteau might as well be addressing the American military and the American public. Is the United States to remain in the Middle East? Again, this goes back to 2004 with Iraq. If so, what are the necessary consequences? Do they include working with former members of the Ba'athist secret police, as recent news stories have suggested? What about nighttime invasion of Iraqi homes and the inevitable shooting of innocent civilians? So now what happened after the war when FLN took power? Apparently they betrayed the promises they implicitly made to Muslims. The triumphant FLN was even at war with itself. In 1965, one faction surrounded another with tanks and ousted it from power. The people at the Capitol literally thought another scene was being shot for the Battle of Algiers. As a portrait of revolution and a war of ideas, it suggests the French went wrong by denying they were foreigners. They treated Algeria as an extension of France. At least one lesson for the United States seems obvious. A liberal Iraqi order is going to have to develop within Iraqi terms, and only the Iraqis themselves can establish those terms. Okay. Does anyone have any points you want to make at this point?
I just want to, one thing, if you talk about terrorists and if they're going to win a war or not win a war, what really wins it is the attitude of the French people. And it didn't talk about that. And if I understand it correctly, they eventually, whatever republic it was, the Third or Fourth Republic folded. De Gaulle comes in and says, we're going to let you vote. And that's when the FLN came in. So
Right,
how
some
much
people
would-
actually blame de Gaulle for what you saw happen
Right.
in the
So we're the terrorists, are very aware of that, and said if we can just do terrible things and keep this going, the French people are going to finally say we don't want any part of this. Not unlike what happened to us in Vietnam.
right,
And
but if
maybe what
you
will
saw,
happen after.
it seemed that they were more aiming for the UN rather than France. They seemed to think if they could turn the opinion of the UN into action from the UN, not necessarily France. I don't think they believed they'd be able to turn France, but they ultimately were able to. But if they could turn the UN, and that's why they did the strike. Did it work? Not really, because the UN decided to kind of step back, but they watched. Did you have something in? No, okay, sorry, I thought you were raising your
But
hand.
this is the way it plays out in the court of public opinion.
Right.
You can't oppress another group for a long time.
Right.
Forever. You, at some point, it's going to shift on you.
Right, exactly. So,
Especially the question you asked earlier, why was France there in the first place?
Right.
The French people are going to say that.
yeah,
What the hell are we doing that?
Yeah. What do we do?
But they were all over the French. I mean, they were
Yes.
in Egypt with the
Yes.
British.
yes,
They were in Tunisia, they were in Morocco, they were in Algeria, of course, they
Right.
were all over.
right. Yeah, they had maybe some imperialistic plans.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Was that an echo of the Second World War, or was that an echo of Napoleon? I mean, why were those their colonies?
Because they have resources and they have ports and there's places to lead battles from. And,
yeah,
You know, you understand, they need, just like we have army bases in Japan.
Germany,
We have,
yep.
they had,
Well, with
Well, yeah,
Egypt,
too.
I know it was the Suez Canal. I
sure.
mean, that
course.
was very big.
Very big strategic port, right?
if you can get people to dig up gold for you and mine things for you and, take it all home with you, that's the good.
Right.
That's going on for hundreds and hundreds of years.
So
Exactly.
this is China's operation in Africa and Asia, how they're doing exactly that, but they're paying for it in some form, but they're still oppressing and controlling those nations in that way.
Right. So Ebert had some interesting take on it too. Let's see, I want to see where I should start reading this. He wrote this in 2004. As France tried to contain a nationalist uprising, methods that were successful would be adapted by Castro and Guevara in Cuba, by the Viet Cong, the Palestinians, the IRA, and South African militants, and are currently, at this time, again, 2004, being employed in Iraq. Okay, he talks about the tapeworm comment. Oh, the Battle of Algiers is a training film for urban guerrillas, Jimmy Breslin declared on TV in 1968. Talks about it being shown by the Black Panthers and the IRA to their members. talks about the Pentagon. Okay, Pontecorvo's film was released at the peak of anti-war sentiment in the United States and had a surprising box office success. It played for 14 weeks in Chicago. It was described at the time as, quote, impartial, unquote, alternating between the stories of the Algerian FLN and the French police and paratroopers assigned to destroy it. And Ebert says in his original 1968 review, I wrote, Pontecorvo has taken his stance, somewhere between the FLN and the French, although his sympathies are on the side of the nationalists. He's aware that innocent civilians die and are tortured on both sides, that bombs cannot choose their victims, that both armies have heroes, and everyone fighting a war can supply rational arguments to prove he's on the side of morality. True up to a point. This is again Ebert. But watching the movie again on the new Criterion DVD, I believe his sympathies were clearly with the FLN. The resistance opens with FLN members walking up to French policemen in the street and shooting them dead, often in the back. Bombs are used against police strongholds. These actions are seen in silence, but when the French respond by blowing up the home of a terrorist, the score by Ennio Morricone becomes mournful as survivors pick through the debris. His score withholds sympathy for the dead police. Pontecorvo does, however, show the French leadership in a relatively objective light. In a film that was cast almost entirely with local non-actors, he uses the Paris stage veteran Jean Martin to play Colonel Matteau, a commander of paratroopers sent in to back up the police. Matteau, himself a member of the French resistance to the Nazis, later a veteran of the French defeat in Indochina, knows a thing or two about urban warfare. He is calm, analytical, strategic in his thinking, and considers the FLN to be the enemy, not a malevolent force. As French public opinion turns against the war, he's besieged by reporters, one of whom quotes Jean-Paul Sartre. Why are the Sartres always born on the other side, Matteau complains. And the journalist says, you like Sartre? He goes, no, but I like him even less as an enemy. All right.
And
Yes.
could you just, we were really fascinated by the actors, their facial expressions, and their eyes. They didn't have a lot of dialogue, but they said it all through their physicality. But how did that work? I mean, there were hundreds of people.
I couldn't see where he got the cast. I was trying to read some of that. There was one comment. There was a film critic who said it. Here it is. And this was from Entertainment Weekly, Owen Gleiberman, in 2004, when the DVD came out. You won't soon forget the face of Brahim Hajjaj, who plays the revolutionary leader Ali as if he were channeling the misery of colonialism into a solitary stare of accusatory outrage. Yeah. I thought that was a really great turn of the phrase there, right? So, right. Now, you know, I saw a bunch of reviews, and there were 89 on Rotten Tomatoes that they listed, 89 reviews, all but one were favorable. And the audience score was 95%. And IMDb actually gave it over an 8, which is almost unheard of, 8 out of 10. The IMDb, usually it's like between 4 and 6 or something out of 10, but they gave it an 8.1. But some of the critics, I'll read the one semi-negative review, which isn't even that negative, but I'll read that in a second.
And I think the fact that they did use the locals as the actors made it so believable and so real.
How great was that kid, right?
Powerful.
The little kid who delivered the papers and he winked at the guy.
And also you talk about women, the women who
Right.
made that call.
Right.
That was unbelievable.
Chilling.
It was so powerful.
That's very, very common.
I know,
Yeah.
but it was so real.
Yes, it is.
And how about when the women got dressed up to go into the bars to plant the bombs, right?
That's part of their upbringing.
Yeah.
When did they use that call?
It's like good, you know, something.
Something that's a happy sound. I thought it was some.
I thought it was an angry. I thought
It's
it was an angry
celebratory.
sound. It was like.
No, Lawrence of
Yeah,
Arabia.
that's what I thought. It looked like a
Remember
rebellion
Lawrence
to
of
me.
Arabia, when they were leaving, those women were doing it. Good luck.
It was 4 hours, I fell asleep before.
All right, one second. Can you explain about the call a little? Like what it means, Sheila? Can
It's
you?
usually with happy things, like I know my aunts, like if you went and you said, my mother didn't do it. I can't say from there, but my aunts, a couple of my aunts did it.
Okay.
It's,
So it was in celebration generally?
yes,
Celebratory.
yes,
That's
yes,
not a lesson.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I know how they got the locals to do as well as they did. Before all of the shootings, they played, there's no business like show, and they look at it, shoot.
The one thing that I found very different between Algiers and Cairo, Egypt, in general, is that in
Speak up, please,
Algiers-
though.
In Algiers, the Europeans were in a separate section. It was the European
Yes.
section.
Clearly.
In Cairo, we didn't have that. We may have had places where the servants and all of that, the lower class, the blue collar, lived. But I had friends, Egyptian friends in school. I went to a French school, but they were there too. Because I think a lot of them, of the higher up in the Arabs in the army and that, married some French people. Or
So that's how they got integrated.
Right,
Yeah.
because like, not Mubarak, the one before Mubarak, he was married to a British woman that was absolutely gorgeous.
Okay.
So it was very different. That
So was
they
Yassar
were,
and
they were more in
Arafat.
the middle, except in
Nasser.
1952.
Nasser.
Yeah,
Nasser,
Nasser,
oh,
when
right.
they burned everything, including my father's store, everything, you know, so.
This was pre-suicide bombers. Like these women
Right.
were phenomenal at dropping it off and had lots of guts, and they weren't killing themselves. They
Right.
were-
Right. Which may be why they didn't look, but what was, I was gonna say, maybe look why they didn't look so nervous, but you did have them pause and look around at all the people that they were about to kill.
I thought she
I
was gonna
thought she
change her
wasn't gonna
mind,
do
right, when she put it down under the stool in
She
the
she
restaurant.
was looking at a little
It
boy,
made you think that she was gonna
Right.
change her mind.
and
right?
I was hoping she would change her mind.
Right.
It was disappointing that she did
Nope.
not change her mind.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's see, the Boston Herald, James Vernier wrote, "It remains one of the greatest depictions of the mutually dehumanizing nature of war ever made." And Christian Science Monitor, David Sterrett wrote, "Like all masterpieces, it speaks to later ages as powerfully and intelligently as to its own." Bosley Crowther in the New York Times, 2003, "It looks beyond any question to be an original documentary film, put together from newsreel footage, complemented by staged dramatic scenes." He gave it 5 out of 5.
Isn't that what makes this film, just that statement, how it looks like reality?
Right.
You know, you just think it's happening, whereas it's a made-up movie based on a story.
Right, and that's why Pontecorvo chose to do it in black and white, to make it look like newsreel footage. That was his intent. Okay, yeah, Sam Jordison in Film 4. "Vital and disquieting, this is a powerful depiction of the pity of war, as shocking today as it was on the day of its release." Oh, this was good too. Let me get this one if I can turn the page back. Need something to separate the pages better. All right, few movies, this is Seattle Times, John Hartle. "Few movies have done such an eloquent, even-handed job of defining the conflict between colonialists and natives determined to free themselves from foreign rule." And Arthur Levere, Culture Vulture, "The verity of a documentary with the narrative drive and emotional charge of a great thriller." Now, the semi-negative review, and it was a guy named Tony Medley, TonyMedley.com. I have no idea who he is. He actually gave it a 5 out of 10, which is mixed, but not totally terrible. But he said something some of you may agree with. "The film has received a lot of praise from critics, but not that many people will find this that entertaining." Okay. All right, so I can't really argue with him too much on that, but that was the most negative review I could find out of everything. Like almost 100 reviews, that was it. Yep. So let's see, back to Roger Ebert. He talks about, about what they did with Ali Lapointe, his initiation to be included with the FLN. And the reason they told him to shoot the cop instead of the informer is that if he were a police stooge, the police wouldn't object to the murder of a civilian, but they wouldn't let an informer shoot a French policeman. By pulling the trigger, he has symbolically committed a murder, earning his entry into the FLN. And then Ebert writes, the reasoning is chilling and carries a terrible weight of logic. The strength of the Battle of Algiers, the reason is being viewed in the Pentagon 35 years after its making, is it is lucid and dispassionate in its examination of the tactics of both sides. It shows the French setting up roadblocks and checkpoints between the Kasbah and the European quarter. It follows the three women, one with a child, who walk right past the checkpoint with bombs in their purses. Colonel Mateau does his job well. His chart of FLN cells has squares that are gradually filled in until, with the final defeat of Ali and the three others trapped in their hiding place, he declares victory. The FLN has been eliminated. 2 years later, the film notes, quote, for no particular reason that anyone could explain, unquote, the uprising began again as mobs poured out of the Kasbah and overwhelmed the police. In 1962, the French granted Algeria its freedom. What lessons a modern viewer can learn depends on who is watching and what they want to see. This is still Ebert. Those who study the French tactics should note that they failed. Although the American use of torture at Abu Ghraib has been credited at least with producing the names and locations of many enemy fighters, the scale of urban warfare in Iraq is escalating. A few days before I wrote this review, some 35 children were killed by a bomb while being given candy by Americans. The moral paradox is that many Iraqis will blame the deaths on us because if we were not there, the bombing would not have taken place. Certainly the bombers were the murderers, but the Battle of Algiers shows now, as it did when it was made, that for nationalist resistance movements, the end justifies the means. President Bush said something in the debate that this film abundantly illustrates. Fighting terrorism is hard work. And I have one thing I did want to get to wrap it up.
We're just going back to Ukraine and Putin. You have to be as ruthless as the person to win the battle at that point in time. And can you do that? Can you be as ruthless?
Right, which kind of goes to what Mateau was saying at the press conference. There's a great picture they have of him marching, that they had that shot of him. Comes on, I mean, I think maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger in a couple of his movies studied this potentially, because this is when Arnold started to become, he wasn't a star yet, but when this movie finally got seen more, I think it kind of illustrates with the sunglasses especially. Yes,
So I have a question.
sure.
To you, Ed. You were the one who chose this movie. Why?
Good question.
Okay, several reasons. I loved it when I first saw it because I thought it was brilliant filmmaking and kind of groundbreaking in the balance it showed. I've seen too many documentaries like, by Michael Moore that are so one-sided. It's really annoying, frankly. And because when I learned in film school was documentaries are supposed to show both sides. And Michael Moore kind of changed that to a great extent. Then I saw this article, January 27th in the New York Times about the tragic page of France's past in Algeria. And I'm thinking, probably very few people have seen this movie, and it is on a bunch of lists. Spike Lee has it as essential viewing. He made a list of about 90 movies that he says these are essential movies, and he has it on his list. Soderbergh has it on his list of all-time greatest films. Martin Scorsese, all-time greatest films. It's on many, many lists of top 100 films, and I'm thinking, practically nobody I know has seen this movie. And a little quick story, when I was in college, I didn't see this movie, even though a friend of mine, and I never forgot his name, because how could you? His name was John Lennon at Syracuse. And he said, Ed, let's go see this movie. And I'm like, the Battle of Algiers, I don't want to see a war movie. And he goes, no, he goes, it's really great, I'm telling you. Well, it took me, 40 years later, whatever it was, to see the movie. And I realized he was right. I ended up seeing a Lena Wertmuller film, who, by the way, has 4 movies on Spike Lee's list. But so it wasn't a bad choice, but I never did come back to this movie and I regretted it. And he was right. Now I saw what he meant and I never got to fully explore it until now. So I felt this was worth sharing, especially timely with what's going on, not only in France, but with the Ukraine invasion. And I felt it seemed to be, if ever you mention it, this would be a good time to do it. So
Thank you.
that's where it came from. Yes.
And did
Mary.
it win any other awards? Did it win?
They didn't really enter it for a lot. So it won the Venice, it was shown at the New York Festival, and it was nominated for a few Oscars, but that was it. Yeah, they didn't show it at a lot of places. So,
They said there was a gap in years. Actually, the screenwriting and something was a year later. at the Oscars and something else. That was
Well, it didn't get shown in America until 67.
It was done in 66.
It was done in 65, 66.
Yeah, Yeah.
And the September 20th was the release date in America of 67. So it was delayed a bit. And then, of course, we know in France, 5 years before they could see it there. So, yeah, it made it kind of hard to,
Mhm.
What did you
Yeah,
think of the Allie's decision at the end not to at least let the child go or
Right.
push him out?
Yeah.
If he took,
Mhm.
he didn't want to go, it looked like the kid.
try to remember his character, which they did describe. He came from
He
nothing.
was a criminal.
He was a
also.
criminal, dirt poor. He had nothing.
Yeah.
This gave him something to live for.
Right.
Now, I would criticize his decision for not just being the only one in there at the
Yeah,
end.
yes,
I don't think that was right, what he did, but
right,
there was a lot of things I don't think were right for what he did.
yeah,
But again, I'm not him, and he's coming from a very different
right.
perspective. I'm not gonna defend him, but I'm just trying to figure out his rationale. But why he took, basically innocent people with him,
Yes.
I don't get it.
Is this truth or just in the film? Is this reality?
It's a mix, because it's based on this guy's memoirs, and they said there were some composite characters, but it's based on a true story. Anytime it's based on a true story, some things are factual, some things are fabricated, or somewhere in between.
Well, they
Dramatic
purposely showed the other one making the choice not
To
go.
surrender, right?
And this one did, so maybe there is some truth in that.
Yeah.
Or dramatic license? Well, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, it really shows that nobody wins in war and that
Yeah.
the unthinkable becomes thinkable to both sides.
What seems to make more tragedy, and I say this because correct me if I'm wrong, the Algerian country has not been that successful since then.
Right, very
So It
true.
makes it even more
Mhm.
tragic
None
that
of it's
people die and
Right.
you try to
Yeah.
decide who was right, who was wrong.
Right.
Yet it didn't lead to any great success. Now,
No, and as I said, immediately after, they had, more than arguments, they had violent confrontations about who was gonna actually be running the country.
Amongst each other.
Yes,
Yeah.
their own factions,
This has
right?
gone on for hundreds of years. Same things happen in Iraq and,
Yes.
and Jamaica got his, is not a well-run country. They got their independence.
Right, in Haiti, right? There's plenty of examples.
Infighting.
What's happening in Algiers now? Does anyone know?
Yeah, it's independent. It is, but yeah, of course, it's corrupt, right?
It's correct.
So how did the Algerians get to France? There was a French colony, so you could go freely and immigrate to France?
Yes,
So they killed France in some ways. They
Yes.
kind of destroyed the French country by allowing so many of that population in some ways.
But it
That's an
wasn't-
argument. That's.
you can make that
You
case.
can make that argument.
Yeah,
It wasn't just the Algerian, actually, they were more fussy about the Algerian rather than the European that lived in Algiers.
Yeah.
But it was also from all the different, from Tunisia, Morocco. Morocco was saved by the king.
No.
The king, it was very good, and they were saved by that.
Did they have a
But,
free reign to go into France as well, these other
yeah,
countries?
they go. I mean, my cousin married a Jewish Moroccan girl.
I thought I read that, what are they called, Pied Noir, with the
Yes.
Algerians that were European that came, but they had a terrible time. when
yes, they were
got
discriminated
France,
against
they were
badly,
discriminated
right?
against.
Right.
And just in contrast,
Yes.
back to my Revolution 101, most revolutions are bloody and immoral and horrible. But there are some exceptions. If you look at Gandhi in India, they practiced pacifism.
But they were getting slaughtered,
They practiced pacifism.
Yes.
And they got rid of the British.
yes, but by a lot of them getting slaughtered, to kind of make the point, we're not fighting back, you're just gonna keep killing us? And a lot of them died making that point, so I wouldn't say it was bloodless.
I didn't say this was.
They had a lot
All
of
right.
people. They had a lot of people.
Yeah, but yeah, they did ultimately win, so that's very true. They did win, but there was a cost. Okay, so there was, Maria Flood, a lecturer in film studies at University of Liverpool, and this is actually just this past October of 2021. The Battle of Algiers, an iconic film whose message of hope still resonates today. She talks about the question of bias, and okay, I just want to get the last point here. If Mateau and the French have reason, what do the Algerians have? Firstly, they have raw visceral emotion and the power of the group. The victory at the end of the film is the victory of the masses, embodied in two figures, the martyr Ali Lapointe, the illiterate everyman who becomes a hero for the revolution, and the gyrating anonymous Algerian women whose gaze outwards to the future closes the film. This takes me to the final point about what the Algerians have on their side, the power of historical right. We see this through Pontecorvo's use of chronology. The narrative proceeds as a flashback until we leap forward in time to the euphoria and mania of the end of the war and the triumph of the revolutionaries. Pontecorvo here glosses over the fact that the real Battle of Algiers was lost by the Algerians and jumps into a future of eventual victory in the war. This is how he views the process of history. The masses, with moral right on their side, will eventually win. So that was all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks
Thanks
for
for coming.
You just hit the stop recording up top first. The other one, the solid one to the